I just go to this one, just gives me a lot of working space. So let's go back to Maya Classic. And so under Window, these editors are all where you'll find the editors. So Attribute Editor, Channel Box, these are all over here already. So you have a Channel Box, Layer Editor, Modeling Toolkit. So moving forward, we're on the general editors, and so we've talked about the Attribute Editor, Channel Box, and the Content Browser is actually just kind of, this is where you can get to examples and samples that Maya provides. Inside here under the general editors as well, our tool settings, which we've talked about, the hypergraph, which is basically what you see is what you get type of you can actually see a graph, so like hierarchy or actual, so if you would rather work in a hypergraph like a graph setting, this is where you would actually do that. I prefer the outliner just for ease of use. There's also a connection part to the hypergraph, which you can actually also change your settings here. So, and also there's the Viewport Editor. Let's see here. Just kind of collapsing that Attribute Editor window. And then here as well, we talked about the After Effects Live Link. That's in the File menu as well. There's an asset. These are all just basically general editors that you use quite a bit of. The channel control is basically the channel box, controlling that. Connection editor is making different connections for like attributes or anything like that. You can make connections with like different objects. And then the component editor, actually this will basically break everything down by components. So if you're there, you can use this to actually make changes to your skinning, skinning to joints, your skin verts. So you can make changes in the component editor, and just to basically show what that looks like. So under smooth skins, if there's a skin, it'll show you exactly how it's skinned and at what percentage. This also shows all the different things, like if you have blend shapes, all this other stuff. It's like springs, particles. So the only time I ever really use the component editor is if I'm doing some light tweaking to skinning. I also use a different tool for that, so sometimes I don't even use the component editor, but that's mainly what that's used for, at least how I use it. Okay, so under here, this is kind of like the display level editor, a layer, not level, layer editor. There's a file path editor, namespace editor. So with namespace editor, this is where you can actually change your namespaces. So if you have multiple objects that use the same name, you can actually have them use a namespace so it doesn't clash. The script editor, which is down in the right corner, and under here, under general editors, there's a command shell, profiler, and evaluation toolkit. I don't use these all too often. Command shell is basically just a shell window where you can enter mail commands and all that. The profiler is basically just a profiling tool for the UI. Okay, then modeling editors. There's the main one that I use obviously is going to be the modeling toolkit, and then the UV editor. There's paint effects, which are pretty fun when if you just want to play around. I don't use it all too often. And then XGen is for hair. I don't really use crease sets as well. Animation editors, so graph editor is important. The tracks editor is, you can use that regularly. There's a camera sequencer. The dope sheet is basically kind of like the graph editor, but if you know animation at all, the old school way of doing timing and stuff is through the dope sheet. And so their use of the dope sheet is actually pretty nice to offset things and do that kind of stuff. There's also a quick rig, which is basically built on human IK. The shape editor, which is basically blend shapes. And then there's a pose editor as well. There's some other tools outside of Maya that I like to use for posing, and I can show that later on. There's a rendering editors, which are basically all up in the menu set in the UI, so you can actually see that as well. Okay, so here we have under Windows still, and in the rendering editors, so render view, which is up in the right hand corner, well, not right hand corner, but right hand side, which basically gives us our render view. So and then we also have render settings, Hypershade. Hypershade is where we do a lot of our material work, and then there's the render setup, and the light editor as well, and then custom stereo rig editor, which is basically using stereo cameras. And so there's other shading group attributes, rendering flags, relationship editors, so light linking, and then also character sets are important in here, animation layers, and different sets, and UV linking. And under the UI elements, this is where you can find how to turn things off if you don't want to use them. So say you turn off the shelf, that's how you get rid of that. And then so if your shelf is ever not showing, you can actually just make sure that that's in the UI elements under Windows. And also you can hide all UI elements, which basically gives you just a bigger real estate to actually work in. So if you want to bring all that back or restore UI elements, that's how you do that. It's kind of like workspaces, but a little different. It's just it just basically breaks everything, the UI elements down by all these different things. So if you don't use the help line, you can just get rid of that. I like to have it just so I can actually see if I have any questions or anything. Usually you can kind of hover over something and it tells you. So you can see that down here below. Like when you roll over something, you can see what it actually does. It's pretty helpful. Under settings and preferences, this is where we get to our preferences, and then all of our hotkey editor stuff, color settings, marking menus, our shelf editor, panel editor, and also our plugin manager. So if you ever have a plugin that's not working, say for OBJ or anything like that, if you click on the plugin manager, you can actually get to the plugin manager. And so just for example, just so OBJ export, sometimes that's unchecked. If you need to export or import OBJs, you just want to make sure that that's actually loaded, and you just click auto load, and then Maya will remember that that's loaded into the plugin manager. So under preferences, this is where you get to the actual preferences inside Maya. So with the interface, you can break things down by just kind of looking through and finding different settings if there's something else that you want to use. So this is also where you can actually turn things off as well in the preferences, as well as the menu items and workspaces. So it's Maya gives you a lot to, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat per se, like the saying that saying to skin a cat. There's many ways to actually do so inside of Maya. Not literally, obviously, but just a way of saying. So also under display, there's some other just different views that you can actually make sure if there's anything like if for Viewport 2.0, if you need to work in DirectX, this is where you change that. Most times OpenGL, some of the newer cards and whatnot use OpenGL. Under let's see, polygons. So this is where you can turn on your face centers or anything like that, but it's also available in the display. So you can turn those on and off. If you turn them on in your settings, it'll actually remember it and keep that setting at all times. So that's one other thing to be aware of. If you make those settings in your preferences, it'll just stay that way. Under settings, this is where you can change your up axis. So if you need to work in Z, and then also the working units, Maya defaults to centimeters. You can change your to meters or millimeters or however yards, however you like to work. I usually like to keep mine at default. And then just if I do export over to, if I export, I make sure that my export gets exported out still at centimeters, but then when I bring it into Unity, it's usually Unity or Unreal. You can scale over there as well. Let's see, some other, so file projects, you can send to a default projects directory, which is kind of around the same thing as when you set a project in your project window. File references, there's just different items inside here that actually, and also undo. If sometimes, I don't know if this has been changed, but it used to go on if you ran out of memory in Maya, it would automatically turn off your undos, and it would just go to off, and then you would have like basically like 50 undos, and that was it. And then you would have to come back and say, no, I want my want this to be on, my undos to be on and infinite, so I can just continually undo if I need to. That's one thing that I've noticed about Maya is sometimes undos can be not a lot, but sometimes undos will actually not work how you think they do. So just be aware of that. That's why I also do a lot of increment and saves. Usually like major changes or anything like that, I'll do an increment and save, which kind of, it'll make many files, but you can also go back in time and see how those files have changed. Let's see. If you're using XGen for hair and stuff, this is where you can change your memory cache as well. And then also at the bottom under applications, this is where you can actually whatever image editing application that you're using, like Photoshop, you can actually just point it to your version of Photoshop you're using, or Krita, or any PaintSci, any tools that you're using for your 2D stuff, you can actually point to right here. And then also sequence viewing, you can put an image sequence where you want that to go, QuickTime, etc. So usually PlayBlast will open with regular media player in Windows at least. So that's where you can change that. And then under, this is where you can find the outliner, but we already have it in our window. Outliner is very Maya-centric. So it usually is pretty easily accessible, but that's where you find the outliner. There's a node editor where you can actually make your in and out connections as well inside here. And then also if you hit tab, this is where you can actually create you know, all the different, you can actually create UV sets. Basically, that's where you can actually make your connections. You can toggle the create node plane on and off. A lot of different things with the node editor. If you there's a lot of lessons that explain how the node editor works online. Under Play Blast is where we get our Play Blasts, and that's also in the right-click menu in the timeline. So this is where we can Play Blast, which will basically do a preview of your animation. And this is, you can minimize the application, raise the main window, and then raise application windows as well. And then all these after windows are basically like how we said, under the different modeling, rigging, animation, effects, rendering. So there is a hotkey for that as well. So F2 is going to be modeling, F3 is rigging, F4 is animation, F5 is effects, and F6 is rendering, F7 is multi-component selection, F8 is going to be object and component mode, F9 is going to be verts, F10 is edge selection, F11 is face selection, F12 is UV selection. And then, so to go back to object mode, I just hit F8. And so that goes over just that in general. Okay, so then the menus, how these menus are kind of built up. So under mesh in the modeling, this is all basically polygon modeling. So this is where we can Boolean, our union, difference, and intersection in booleans. This is where we combine meshes. We can also separate meshes. And then here we can fill holes, reduce, remesh, retopologize. I like to manually retopologize. It does an okay job. I prefer to do it myself just because I know exactly where I want my loops and how I want to build my geometry. We'll go over that in the modeling toolkit. It's actually really great. The retopologize tool is really awesome in Maya. I find I enjoy using it. Smooth, this is where we can throw smooths on our objects. You can also triangulate and quads. So quadrangulate is not, it doesn't do an awesome job. I mean, it does an okay job. You can actually change your angle threshold and everything. So if it tries to actually throw a decent amount of quads down, I find that with remesh and retopo, it does an okay job with that. I don't use those very often. And these are pretty new to Maya. And then this is where we mirror. And then also you can transfer attributes. So you can actually transfer UVs, you can transfer vertex normals, anything like that. Or UVs and basically vertex positions. This is where you can actually transfer those attributes, and it does a decent job. It's not amazing by any means, but it does okay. You can transfer the vertex order as well. This cleanup optimize basically goes through and looks for like four-sided faces, concave faces, and you can turn the ones on and off that you don't. If you like non-planar faces, this will actually look for that, and then it'll try and fix it for you. Sometimes I like to run this just to make sure that if I did any weirdness in my polygon modeling, it'll try and it also cleans up non-manifold geometry, which does a pretty good job. Also, let's see, smooth proxy, so you can actually go into subdiv mode in here as well. So also, one thing to point out is if you hit number 1, that's actually the lowest division. If you hit 2, it goes into and kind of starts to break things. You get a little bit more smoother object. and you can see kind of how the divisions are. There's an outside cage, and if I hit 3, that actually smooths everything down to kind of a subdiv, so you can actually work at a lower polygon, but it actually smooths everything down. So if I go back to 1, you can see that I'm back to the lower version. So sometimes it's good to work low poly, and then if you just hit 3 on the smooth, that's what I would render, because then I have a smoother ball or smoother sphere or a character, whatever the polygon object is. And it usually likes to keep, if you have hard edges, it actually keeps those under consideration. So let's see, moving along here, under the edit mesh, this is where we can add divisions, bevel, bridge, circularize, collapse, connect, detach, extrude, merge to center. You can flip, symmetrize. So if you're modeling in Symmetry, it'll actually do a pretty good job with symmetrizing. You can average your vertices, chamfer, and edges. So this basically breaks it down for, if you're going to edit your mesh, it breaks it down by component, obviously, and then by vertex, edges, and faces. And then also curves. You can project a curve on a mesh, and then you can also, it's kind of cool with the, if you do have curve, you want to extract a curve from your mesh, it actually does a pretty good job. Mesh tools, so this is where we can actually append a polygon, we can connect. These are just kind of like tools, and this is also where you can find the modeling toolkit if it's so you can hide it and also show it. So Quad Draw is basically the topology tool, which does a really great job. This is our Sculpt tool, where we can do some basic sculpting. It's nothing like ZBrush, but you can do some pretty decent and fun stuff. So if I do go to Sculpt mode, let's see here. Yeah, the Sculpt mode. I think I have to have a better, I think if I'm under, I'm not too sure why I'm not getting exactly what I'm looking for right there, but anyway, as moving along, so here we can do, so Multicut is actually a really good tool as well. So you can actually start outside and just do a cut, and it tries to find, so as you draw, you can just basically left drag, and that basically sends that cut all the way through the object. So like if I make a cut here, it cuts all the way through. And I believe if you have, so under Mesh Tools, Multicut, I believe you can, let's see here. Yeah, camera-based selection under selection style. And I think there's a way to actually, like in Blender, if you want to backface cull that, that's how you do that. Let's see here. So under Mesh Tools still, there's a Creasing Tool. You can create polygons by just going like, and if I say create polygons, it just basically, I can just start creating. So one thing with, I notice, yeah, so if I go here, I have to continue to click around. So if I go here, if I want to draw a quad, that's how I just draw those four faces. And so obviously the normals are currently not, so that's why we see black, and so all we have to do is reverse the normals. To do that, we just go to object mode, and then we go under mesh display, and we can reverse the normal, and now we're seeing the normal from this way. And so now if we do any, say we want to extrude, if you go to the move tool by hitting W, and then also we would need to modify center the pivot on this object, and then now if we hold down the shift, it's actually going to clone. And so for that, if you want to extrude, you can hold down shift and right click, and then here you can extrude, and then that will give you the extrusion based on that poly. So this is where you can also add, you can add your thickness here, you can offset, and then also add divisions if you need to. Once that menu goes away, if you go back to here, you can actually, this is where you can add subdivisions, and then also under the extrusion, this is where you can actually throw on so tapers. This is where we get to our attributes in the inputs. And then also this is where our attribute editor, we can find all of our transform attributes, as well as other like the shape node, and under our extrude faces. So this is where you can actually change your divisions, offset, thickness. You can do all that from here as well. So let me get rid of this. So under mesh tools still, this is where we can insert edge loops, we can make holes, our multicut tool, offset edge loops, paint reduce weights, paint transfer attributes, quad draw, our sculpting tools, slide edges, and target weld. Target weld is actually really nice. I find that using the target weld does a really good job, really easily. So if I do go to target weld, go to my object, this is where I can actually just, it's just kind of a drag, click and drag to how, if you want to get rid of different polygons, if you're doing any reduction or anything like that, that's kind of a way of doing so by using the target weld tool. It does a pretty good job. So just no rhyme or reason, but it actually cleans up. It can actually does a pretty good job with cleaning up areas that you need to actually get rid of polys, and then that way that you don't have to worry about any merging. So you'll see that I only have one vert, so it actually just welds everything all right from the get-go. It's kind of nice. Looks like there's two. So yeah, if that ever happens, also I like to, that was two verts selected, but when you're modeling, I always select all my verts, and if you right click, hold down shift and right click, you can actually merge your vertices, and then if you, the threshold I just kind of leave at 0.01, and so anything that's right on top of another, it'll basically merge all your verts down. So actually I'm just going to F8 out of that, and I'm going to just get rid of that one and create a new polygon sphere. So moving along, after mesh tools, Under mesh display, this is where we can see our normals. We can harden, soften edges, lock the normals, unlock normals, vertex colors, vertex color sets, and you can vertex bake. You can do your baking, bake your vertex lights, your vertex color and lighting. You can actually bake that, and then display attributes per like display colors, material blends, so you can actually make those changes. Under curves, this is basically going to be for NURBS, and surfaces is also for NURBS curves. And deforming, these deforms are basically, so you can do all the different deforms like lattices, wraps, shrink wraps, wire. This is where our non-linear bends, sine waves, squash, twist, waves. This actually has a lot of just different, there's a jiggle deformer. You actually put a jiggle on things. This is where we can add blend shapes, lattice, or where we edit. So if we need to edit our blend shapes, this is where you would do that. This is where we can, this is for paint weights, and you can also export and import weights as well from the deform menu. I don't use these fairly often. I use different export and import tools for weighting. And then under the UV editor, this is where the UV menu, this is where we can get to our UV editor, and then also where we can assign. This is assigning, so we can create a checker shader and it'll actually create a new checker shader. You can auto, under camera, you can send camera normals. You could put a cylindrical map, planar, spherical, and then this is where you can do auto seams. I don't prefer to use auto seams. I like to actually know exactly where my cuts are when I'm unwrapping. And then there's a 3D cut and sew UV tool and a 3D grab UV tool. I will use the 3D cut and sew UV tool fairly often. This is where you can delete your UVs, merge UVs, split. But under the UV editor, so if I bring that up, the UV toolkit actually has a lot of those, a lot of the things that you're looking for inside the UV editor. Maya's UV editor actually really, I find it really useful. You can do a lot of powerful moving, transforming. You can pin areas, create. Basically, you can do everything UV-wise from the UV toolkit. So actually, that's really helpful. So I don't really use the menu system all that often. Under generate is going to be our XGen information. And so, let's see, under cache is kind of, this is where Alembic, if we need to import and export Alembic files, this is where we do that from. The geometry cache I don't really use fairly often, or GPU cache I don't use as often either. Comet tools for me are just, I use these mainly for like renaming, and then I also create shapes. It's kind of a rigging tool. You can zero out things easily, set constraints, bunch of different, there's an auto tangent tool for the animation. So it's just under his website, Comet Cartoons, this is where you can grab his tools, and I can kind of show how those tools work a little later on. Arnold is the renderer. The Arnold renderer, actually really nice. This is where you get to the skydome lights, area lights, any lighting that is specific to Arnold, that's where you find that. There's some other, there's utilities for Arnold as well. So if when Arnold uses TX files, so it usually will actually take your TIFF or anything like that and convert it to a TX file. And this is the help guide actually for Arnold. And there's also tutorials, actually really helpful if you're trying to learn about Arnold and what's possible, these tutorials. But then there's a ton of stuff on YouTube that actually is really helpful in regards to Arnold. Arnold is a really nice render. It's pretty clean. And then under the help menu, so you can find basically any kind of, you can find anything in the find menu. Also the Maya help, it also is the F1 key, which will bring up a web page to Autodesk Maya help, what's new in the version that you're using. There's also a learning channel and tutorials, so Maya tutorials. There's like a learning path, and then scripting. This is where you find, if you want to learn how to script, this is where that's located. These are the Maya communities. So area community is a Autodesk specific community, and their Facebook page. And then also there's bonus tools. So you can download bonus tools, just add some extra different tools inside of a menu for bonus tools. And this is how you get to your Autodesk account. You can actually report a problem, do anything like that. This is basically, and then this kind of tells you what version of Maya you're using. So if you're using an updated version, it'll tell you what version you're using. And then the Maya homepage will actually just go to Autodesk Maya right from the get-go. Okay, and then we went over these items here. A lot of this is all from the menu set. So this is going to be new scene, open, save, undo, and redo. So I don't really use these buttons all that often. I do use these every once in a while if I want to just go into component mode like right away. I just know that, and currently I'm just in Vertex. So if I want to go back to object mode, you can either right click on the object and just go back to object mode, or you can actually just click that button there. That actually helps. This menu right here is a masking. It's kind of a selection mask. So if you don't want to select surfaces, you can undo that, and then it won't let you. So if you just want to say select joints, you can actually turn everything off and just have skeleton joints in the selection mask turned on. This is where you can turn on locators and other items. This will actually lock and unlock your current selection, and this is also a highlight selection mode. So this locks component selection mode, preventing you to go back to object selection mode. So this actually, if you want to stay in component mode and don't want to actually go out into object mode, that's how you lock that. This is snapping, so you can actually snap to grids, and these are all under hotkeys. So X being the grid, C being a curve, V being a point, and then snap to projected center I don't use fairly often, and view planes I don't use as much either. And then make a selected object live is actually, if you select that, select the object to make live, and then you click on that. Now the object is live, and it shows that it's live right here by just calling it pSphere1, which is that object. And so now that this is a live object, this is how you would actually start to retopo. So say I wanted to retopologize this guy, I would go to my modeling toolkit and go to Quad Draw. And I'm just doing this really fast just to show. So this is how using this to retopologize. This is how you would do that. but you can see that it stays on the surface and does a pretty good job. This is basically how you would re-topo. And we'll go over this. I'm just kind of just basically showing a quick overview of Quad Draw and how that works. So with that, made a new surface, and I'm just going to delete that surface, go back to object mode, and currently it's showing as a live surface. So to turn that off, we just click that, and so it basically tells us live is disabled now. Now we're back in object mode to that actual sphere. So this is where we can turn symmetry on and off. You can also do that from the modeling toolkit, and that is located here under symmetry and also here. Like I said, many different ways to do things inside Maya. This is our input and output connections. This is how we can input. We can see the upstream and downstream. So input and outputs. This is our construction history. These are all of our render settings, as well as our Hypershade, which does our material work, material shaders. And this is a light editor, so if we have any lights in our scene, we can actually turn off, hide, change colors, and affect all the other things. So this actually pauses our display update, so we won't see that. And then the shelf editor. With the shelf editor, this is where basically everything is kind of broken down into quick items that are used fairly often. So under curves and surfaces, they're kind of put together, and you can see this line. So it's curves, and then there's this line, and then you have surfaces. And that's basically the same thing as these menus, but a little different, okay? But this is how you get to, if you're using like different things from the menu set, you can actually, if I want to add something that's not on here, so like say I want CV hardness to show up in my shelf, if I go to curves and go to CV hardness and hold down Control and Shift and then left click, you'll see that it puts it in that shelf. So now my CV hardness tool actually shows up in my curves and surfaces shelf. So if I use that on the regular, and I'm just making sure, I'm just looking through here, doesn't look like that's in the menu set, but if you use that a lot, you can add it to your shelf, and that actually helps have access to that a little faster. That way you don't have to go into the menu, or if you're using the hotbox, you can get there that way as well. There's a lot of different ways, like I said, to use Maya. Really custom user interface friendly. And so with that, as I made this new button inside the shelf, the way you have to, if I was to close down Maya and open Maya back up, that would no longer be in the shelf. So what you need to do is go to this little gear box on the left-hand side and say Save All Shelves. That actually makes sure next time Maya opens up, if you open up this shelf, you'll have that button actually show up in the shelf. So basically just saves your shelf. You can create new shelves by just going to New Shelf. And so if we name it whatever, poly menu. So now we have a new poly menu shelf, and say we're going to use quite a bit of tools, like we're going to duplicate, extract, symmetrize, connect, bevel. So you basically can set your own little poly menu that you use regularly, and say we're going to use the Multicut tool and just some other things, Quad Draw. This is how you would set up a shelf menu for that. And then you would also want to make sure that you save all shelves, and then basically that poly menu will get saved in the shelving. If you want to delete, this is where you delete shelves. So and make sure it confirms. So now it's no longer there. This is a custom menu that I actually use. So like if there's a lot of things that I use to get too fast, I just go here. Makes things a little easier. So there's a poly modeling shelf, sculpting, rigging, animation, rendering, effects. So there's an Arnold one, Bifrost and Bullet. Bifrost and Bullet is kind of like a collision system. The Mesh network, which is for motion graphics, and you can do a lot of pretty cool stuff with. There's also a motion graphics menu, or motion graphics shelf, which basically is it's very mesh centric. So there's some skinning tools that I use. There's an XGen user as well. NG Skin Tools, which is a skinning tool that I use, and then XGen. So for hair,